Mrs. Freeman.
What do you need?
Pleasure doing business with you, Mrs. Freeman.
I didn't ask you to do that.
I know. Yours were worn through at the palm. I'm trying to be the reason you don't have to work hard alone.
The town of Miles City, Montana Territory, had an opinion about Delia Freeman, and it had held that opinion for 3 years, since the morning Thomas Freeman was carried in from the freight road with a wagon wheel across his chest, and his young widow had walked into the forge the very next week and lit the fire herself. People had expected her to sell. A blacksmith shop was heavy work, hot work, work that blistered a person's hands and bent their back, and everyone in town agreed, in the particular way small towns agree on things without ever holding a vote, that it was not work for a woman alone. Delia had not sold. She had taken Thomas's leather order book, still creased open to the page he'd left it on, and she had kept the forge running through 2 Montana winters that had broken stronger businesses than hers. She was 30 years old, and she could shoe a horse faster than any man in 3 counties, and she never once apologized for either fact. The trouble was not that she couldn't do the work. The trouble, as far as Miles City was concerned, was that she did it too well, too visibly, and without the appropriate amount of gratitude for whatever help a man might have offered her, had she asked. She hadn't asked. 2 men had proposed to her in the years since Thomas died. One a rancher who needed a bookkeeper more than a wife. One a freight agent from Bozeman who'd told her, meaning it as flattery, that a woman who could do a man's work must be lonesome for a man's company. She had turned down both, and the town had settled on its verdict, the way frost settles on a window, slowly, and then all at once. Delia Freeman was too much, too capable, too proud, too much woman for the ordinary run of Montana men to take on. She kept the shop anyway. Freeman, Freight and Forge, the sign still read, the letters repainted every spring by her own hand. It was a Tuesday in September, the shipping season just beginning to turn the whole town toward the rail depot, when Jesse Calder walked through her door for the first time. He was 34, trail-worn in the particular way of a man who had spent the better part of a decade pushing cattle up from Texas, and he had just signed on as foreman at the Diamond K, the largest spread shipping out of Miles City that fall. He needed a full set of wagon gear reforged before the herd came in. Chain hitches, brake rods, a dozen things that could kill a man if they failed at the wrong moment on a loaded grade. He had learned that the hard way once, though he didn't say so, not that morning. Delia was at the anvil when he came in, finishing the shoe on a gelding tied at the rail outside. She didn't stop working. She set the hammer down at the natural break in the rhythm, not a second before, and only then turned to look at him. He was taller than her by a head, sun-marked across the forearms, and he was looking at the shop, not at her, with the particular attention of a man checking whether a place was run well before he decided anything else about it. She noted that. It told her something. "Morning," she said. "What do you need?" "Chain hitches," he said. "Brake rods. Full rig for 20 wagons. Diamond K account. Name's Jesse Calder. I'm the new foreman out there." 20 wagons is a big order, this close to shipping, she said, and it wasn't a question. It was an assessment, the kind she made 100 times a week. "I can do it. It'll take the better part of 3 weeks, if nothing else comes through the door first." "Something else will come through the door," he said. "This is a working shop." It was such a plain thing to say, and so exactly true, that she almost smiled. "Most men who come in here for a big order want to know if I can handle it," she said. "You didn't ask." I can see the shop, Jesse said. I can see the work on that gelding's shoe. I don't generally ask a question I already know the answer to. Their eyes held a moment longer than the transaction required. Not bold, not searching for anything. Just two people who had each independently decided the other was worth a second look and weren't going to pretend otherwise. Delia was the one who reached for the order book first. 20 wagons, she said, writing it down in Thomas's book, in her own hand now, under 3 years of her own entries. I'll need the specifications by Thursday, if you want it done before the herd comes in. I'll bring them myself, Jesse said. He didn't need to say that. The specifications could have come with any hand from the Diamond K. Delia noticed the choice of words and did not comment on it, only nodded once, the way she nodded at any settled piece of business, and went back to the gelding's hoof. Jesse Calder rode back out to the Diamond K that afternoon and found that he was still thinking about the forge 3 miles later. Not the wagon gear, not the order, but the particular economy of a woman who did not waste a single motion and who had looked at him like he was a fact to be assessed rather than a man to be managed. He told himself it was professional interest. It was, as far as it went, true. Thursday came, and Jesse brought the specifications himself, exactly as he'd said he would, though the ranch's bookkeeper could easily have sent them with the supply wagon that made the trip into town twice a week regardless. Delia was expecting him and did not let herself examine too closely why she'd noticed the time. He handed her the paper, measurements for the chain hitches, the diameter needed for the brake rods, all of it correct and specific, in a way that told her he understood the mechanics of what he was asking for, which was rarer than it should have been among the men who came through her door. She read it over the counter, and he waited, and neither of them filled the silence with anything unnecessary. "This is good work," she said, meaning the specifications. "Most foremen send me guesses." "I don't send guesses," he said. "Guessing's how a man loses a wagon on a grade." Something passed behind his eyes when he said it, brief, and closed over quickly, and Delia, who had learned to read the weather in people the same way she read it in iron, by the color and the give, filed it away without asking. Not yet. Some doors a person opened when they were ready, and not a moment before. She looked back down at the paper instead, running a finger along the column of measurements. Whoever taught you to spec a rig taught you well. Most men who've only worked cattle, not freight, forget the brake rods need a different tolerance than the hitches. You didn't forget. Spent 2 winters hauling supply wagons before I ever pushed a cow, Jesse said. Freight teaches you things cattle work doesn't. Mostly, it teaches you what happens when the iron's wrong and there's nobody but you to answer for it. That's most of what this shop teaches too, Delia said, and there was something like recognition passing between them again, quiet and unhurried, the particular ease of 2 people discovering they spoke the same practical language. She had coffee going on the small stove at the back of the shop, the way she always did through the long working hours, brewed strong enough that Ruth Boone at the diner across the street called it punishment in a cup. She poured a second cup, without entirely deciding to, and set it on the counter near him. "You don't have to stay," she said. "The order's written down." "I know," Jesse said, and took the coffee anyway, and didn't leave. They talked, in the unhurried way of 2 people who had each spent years being careful about who they let past the first layer of conversation. He told her about the trail up from Texas, 3 states, a decade of it, and why he'd taken the Diamond K job when 3 other outfits had made him offers. She told him, when he asked plainly, and without any of the delicate hedging most people used, that the forge had been Thomas's, and that she'd learned the trade from his uncle Ezra rather than let it die with him. "That coffee," Jesse said eventually, setting the empty cup down. Could probably strip paint. Nobody's ever complained twice, Delia said. I'm not complaining, he said. I'll take another, if you're offering. She hadn't been, particularly, but she poured it anyway, and there was a small private amusement in the exchange that neither of them put into words. It was the first time in longer than she could easily count that a conversation in her shop had gone somewhere pleasant without her having to steer it there herself. By the time he left that afternoon, the light was going long and gold across the street, and Delia realized she had let a full hour pass without once checking the clock on the wall, something she did, out of old habit, every few minutes on an ordinary day, the way a person keeps one hand on a ledger even when they trust the numbers. Ruth Boone crossed the street not 20 minutes later, drying her hands on her apron, with the particular look of a woman who has been watching a window with great interest. That's twice this week, Ruth said. The Diamond K. foreman. He's got an order in, Delia said, not looking up from the gelding's second shoe, which did not, strictly speaking, need her attention at that exact moment. Ruth said, in the tone of a woman who had run a diner across from a blacksmith shop for 11 years and had seen a great many orders come and go without their owners staying for coffee. 20 wagons is a big order. Must take a lot of checking in on. Ruth. I'm not saying anything, Ruth said, already turning back toward her own door, smiling in a way that suggested she had, in fact, said exactly what she meant to say. Delia finished the shoe, set the gelding loose, and told herself Ruth's teasing deserved no further thought. It stayed with her anyway, the way a burr stays caught in a sleeve long after a person has stopped noticing it's there, small and persistent and impossible to fully ignore. She had learned, in 3 years of running the shop alone, to keep a careful distance between herself and any man who lingered past the length of his business. It was a habit born of necessity. Men who lingered usually wanted something, whether they knew it themselves or not, and she had grown tired of discovering what, after the fact. Jessie Calder had lingered for an hour over a coffee strong enough to strip paint, and she found, turning the afternoon over in her mind that evening, that she could not identify a single thing he seemed to want from her, beyond the conversation itself. Delia let it go. But that night, after the shop was closed and the fire banked low, she found herself thinking about the way Jessie Calder had looked at her specifications sheet, not at her hands, not at the size of the shop, but at the work itself, as though the work were the whole of the conversation worth having. It had been a long time since anyone had offered her that particular kind of attention. She told herself it didn't mean anything yet. She was careful enough, by now, to know that yet was doing quiet work in that sentence. By the end of the second week of September, the true shape of Delia's trouble had not changed, only sharpened, the way trouble does as a deadline gets closer. The note was folded in the bottom drawer of the shop's small desk, the one that locked, and it said, in the exact language of the Territorial Trust Bank, that the loan taken against Freeman Freight and Forge 2 winters ago, the winter the well nearly froze solid and half her customers went a season without paying, would come due in full before the spring thaw. The shipping season was her one chance to earn enough to clear it. 20 wagons for the Diamond K, plus whatever smaller work came through the door between now and the last train out, had to cover 3 years of a debt she had never told anyone the full size of. She did the math most nights after closing, by lamplight, the numbers moving less in her favor than she wanted them to. The note itself was not the largest debt Miles City had seen. The Pruitt operation carried 3 times the sum, with the bank's blessing, backed by a name the bank trusted without question. But Delia had learned, in 3 years of managing the shop's accounts, that the size of a debt mattered less than who was left standing behind it when the note came due. Thomas had died owing nothing. She had borrowed against the forge herself, in her own name, the winter after his death, when the well froze and half the ranchers stretched their payments into spring, and she had told no one in town the full figure, not even Ruth, because a woman's debt was the kind of fact Miles City liked to discuss at length once it learned it. Ezra Coates came by most afternoons, the way he had since Thomas died, ostensibly to check the fire and complain about the quality of coal she was buying, though everyone, including Ezra, understood the visits were really about her. He was past 70 now, his hands too stiff for the close work anymore, but his eyes weren't stiff at all, and they'd been watching her closely enough lately that she'd started angling herself so the shop's ledger wasn't visible from his chair. "You're not sleeping," Ezra said that Thursday. "Not a question." "I'm shipping 20 wagons in 3 weeks, Delia said. "Sleep's a luxury item this month." "Thomas would take a strap to you for working like this," Ezra said, though there was no real heat in it, only the particular worry of an old man who had already buried one Freeman and did not care to watch the trade kill the other. "Thomas isn't here to strap anybody," Delia said, gentler than the words sounded, and Ezra let it go, the way he let most things go with her, because he'd learned a decade ago that pushing Delia Freeman only made her dig in deeper. He stayed a while longer than usual that afternoon, sorting nails into their bins with hands too stiff now to do much more, and watching her work with the particular attention of a man, measuring how much longer a thing he loved could hold together under strain. He did not ask about the bank. He had guessed enough of it already, from the hours she kept and the way she flinched, faintly, whenever the mail arrived. "Your husband built this place to outlast him," Ezra said finally, as he was leaving. "Don't let it cost you what it cost him." Delia didn't answer that directly. She only nodded and watched him go, and turned back to the ledger with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had already decided the forge was worth whatever it cost her, and was not yet ready to examine whether that was wisdom or simply grief wearing wisdom's coat. Jessie came by that same afternoon to check the progress on the brake rods, and found her working alone at the forge with her sleeves rolled past the elbow, the September heat and the fire heat combining into something that had her wiping her forehead with the back of one wrist every few minutes. He didn't ask if she needed help. He'd learned enough about her in 2 weeks to know that question, asked directly, would get him a short answer and a closed door. Instead, he walked to the wagon frame she was fitting, put both hands on the far end of the axle she was trying to hold steady, with one arm, while she hammered with the other, and simply held it. Delia looked up. Hammer paused mid-stroke. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "I know," Jessie said. "Some things don't need asking. Keep going. It's not getting any lighter while we talk about it." She kept going. The axle held steady under his grip the whole time, and the weld came out cleaner and faster than it would have alone, and neither of them made anything of it out loud. It was, Delia thought afterward, a small thing. It did not feel small. "Thank you," she said, when the piece was set aside to cool. "You don't have to thank a man for holding a piece of metal," Jessie said. "Most men around here would want credit for it," she said. "A story to tell at the saloon about how they helped Delia Freeman." Something flickered across his face, not offense, but a kind of recognition, as though she'd named a thing he'd already noticed about the town and hadn't liked. "I'm not most men," he said, simply, and went back to checking the wagon specifications like the moment hadn't happened, though they both knew it had. That night, doing the math again by lamplight, Delia found the numbers no less worrying than they'd been the night before. But for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, the worry sat differently in her chest, less like a weight she carried alone, and more like a weight someone had, without asking permission, quietly gotten a hand under. Word travels in a cattle town, the way water travels downhill, finding every low place without any particular effort. And by the 3rd week of September, it had reached Jesse Calder, delivered by Hollis Andrews, the Diamond K's longtime horse wrangler, and a man who considered himself something of an authority on matters of the heart. "You've been spending a fair amount of time at the Freeman place," Hollis said, over the evening feeding, in the tone of a man about to do a friend a service. "I've got 20 wagons being built there," Jesse said, not looking up from the harness he was mending. Sure, Hollis said. "Just, a man ought to know what he's stepping into, is all. Delia Freeman's a fine woman, don't get me wrong. Sharp as a tack, runs that shop better than her husband did, God rest him. But she's a lot, Calder. Won't take help from anybody, never has. Turned down Grady Pruitt's cousin, and that freight agent from Bozeman both, and half the town thinks she did it, just to prove she didn't need either one." "Maybe she didn't need either one," Jesse said. "Maybe," Hollis allowed. "But a man likes to feel needed, don't he? That's half of what marriage is." Jesse set the harness down and looked at him directly, which had a way of ending most conversations Jesse didn't care to continue. "I don't need to feel needed," he said. "I need to feel like the person across from me has got something worth saying, and worth doing, and isn't pretending to be smaller than she is to make somebody comfortable. That's rarer than you'd think, Hollis. I'd rather find it in a woman who doesn't need me than waste my life on one who only wants me because she's scared to stand alone." Hollis blinked, chewed on that a moment, and scratched at his jaw. "You're a strange one, Calder," he said, finally. "Probably," Jesse agreed, and picked the harness back up. Hollis wandered off toward the corral, unconvinced, but no longer inclined to argue, and Jesse sat with the harness a while, without actually mending it, turning Hollis's warning over the way a man turns over a coin he isn't sure is counterfeit. He had heard variations of it 3 times now, since arriving in Miles City. From the liveryman, from a hand at the Diamond K bunkhouse, from Hollis just now. Always delivered with the same careful concern, always resting on the same unspoken assumption that a woman capable of running her own shop, holding her own accounts, and refusing help she hadn't asked for, was a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be known. He thought of Daniel then, briefly, the way he still did most days without meaning to, how their mother had said much the same thing about their father once, that a man too proud to ask for help was more trouble than he was worth, and how Jesse had spent 6 years since Daniel's death deciding that pride and competence were not, in fact, the same failing dressed in different clothes. He rode into town the next morning with a purpose he hadn't quite admitted to himself yet, and stopped first at the dry goods store before the forge, which was not on his usual route. He bought a pair of work gloves, good leather, sized for a woman's hand rather than a man's, the kind that would actually protect against forge burns instead of just looking like protection, and he carried them into Freeman Freight and Forge, without any particular speech prepared. Delia was at the counter, going over the books, and looked up when the bell over the door rang. "You're early," she said. "Rods aren't ready till Friday." "Didn't come for the rods," Jesse said, and set the gloves on the counter, plain as setting down a hammer. "Yours are worn through at the palm. Noticed it Thursday." Delia looked at the gloves, then at him, and something in her face, careful, guarded, the expression of a woman used to gifts arriving with a price attached, softened by degrees as she turned them over and found they were, in fact, exactly her size, exactly the weight she needed for close work at the anvil, not the decorative kind a man bought when he wanted credit for thoughtfulness without understanding the thing he was being thoughtful about. "These are forge gloves," she said. "Real ones." I asked Ruth what size you'd need, Jessie admitted. Didn't want to guess. Delia pulled them on, right there at the counter, testing the fit the way she tested everything, with her hands, not her eyes, and found they fit perfectly, snug at the wrist, room enough at the knuckle to close a fist around a hammer handle. She didn't say anything for a moment. When she looked up, there was a smile on her face she hadn't planned, and didn't try particularly hard to hide. The real one, not the polite one she gave customers, the one that reached all the way to her eyes before she remembered herself and reached for the ledger instead. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than the words could carry. "Don't thank a man for gloves," Jessie said, echoing her own words back at her. And this time it was Delia who laughed, short, surprised, genuine, before either of them could decide it meant anything more than it did. It meant more than it did. They both knew it. Neither said so yet. She wore the gloves the rest of that week, and found, without particularly planning to notice it, that her palms no longer stung raw by the end of a long day, the way they had for 3 years. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing she had stopped expecting anyone to think of on her behalf. She kept catching herself looking up whenever the bell over the door rang, and finding she was disappointed on the afternoons, it wasn't him. The trouble arrived on a Monday, delivered not by Amos Pruitt himself, but by the sight of his handwritten bid, nailed to the notice board outside the Diamond K's main office, a price for wagon reforging and gear maintenance undercutting Delia's contract by nearly a third, with a promise of completion, before the shipping deadline, that anyone who understood the work knew was closer to a gamble than a guarantee. Walter Kepler, who owned the Diamond K and had signed Delia's contract himself back in August, sent word into town asking her to come explain why he shouldn't switch the remaining work to Pruitt Overland Freight and save the ranch several $100s in a year when every dollar mattered. Delia rode out that same afternoon, the September wind sharp enough now to carry the season's first real warning of what was coming, and found Kepler in his office, with Pruitt's bid still sitting on the desk between them like a challenge. "I signed with you because your work's good, Mrs. Freeman," Kepler said, not unkindly, but with the flat practicality of a man who ran cattle for a living and couldn't afford much sentiment. "But Pruitt's asking a third less, and a third less matters this year. Pruitt's asking a third less because he's subcontracting the ironwork to a smith in Billings who's never seen your wagons and won't know your grades," Delia said. "You'll get gear that fits on paper and fails on the trail. I've seen what a bad chain hitch does on a loaded grade. I imagine you have too." She said it plainly, without pleading, laying the facts down the way she laid iron on the anvil, with confidence in the material, not in her ability to charm him into agreeing. Kepler studied her for a long moment, then studied the bid, then looked back at her. "I'll give you 2 more weeks to prove the work holds," he said finally. "But if anything from your shop fails during shipping, I'm switching to Pruitt for spring, and I won't be quiet about why." It was not a defeat, but it was not the reassurance she'd hoped to ride home with either, and the 2-week shadow of it sat over her the whole way back to town. She rode slower than she needed to, letting the horse pick its own pace along the frost-hardened road, and used the time to run the numbers again in her head, the way she always did when a thing frightened her, as though arithmetic could be a kind of armor. 2 weeks to prove the work held. 2 weeks against a debt that didn't care whether she proved anything at all, only whether the money arrived on schedule. Pruitt's bid sat behind her eyes the whole ride. A third less, a third less, the words keeping time with the horse's hooves, until she was heartily sick of the sound of her own worry. Jessie was waiting at the shop when she returned, having heard about Pruitt's bid from Hollis before she'd even left for the Diamond K, and he met her at the door, with the particular urgency of a man who wanted to fix something immediately. "I could talk to Kepler," he said. "Tell him what I know about your work firsthand. Tell him what a bad hitch nearly." "I don't need you to fight my battles for me," Delia said, sharper than she meant it, the day's strain coming out sideways at the one person who hadn't caused any of it. "I've been running this shop alone for 3 years, Jesse. I don't need a man riding in to vouch for my work like I can't stand behind it myself." The words landed harder than she'd intended, and she saw it land, saw something close, briefly, behind his eyes. The particular hurt of a man being lumped in with every other man who'd tried to manage her rather than stand beside her. "I wasn't offering to vouch for you," Jesse said, quiet now, careful. "I was offering to help. There's a difference, even if half this town's never learned it." He left without another word, not angry, but withdrawn, in a way that was worse than anger. And Delia stood alone in the shop doorway, watching him ride off, the regret arriving almost before he was out of sight. She had spent 3 years building walls sturdy enough that no one could mistake her for needing rescue. She had not yet learned how to tell the difference, in the moment, between a man trying to take something from her and a man simply trying to stand nearby. That night she did not do the books. She sat by the cooling forge a long while, instead turning the new gloves over in her hands, and did not like what the silence in the shop had to tell her about the last few hours. She thought about riding out to the Diamond K to say so plainly, and decided against it twice before the night was through, not out of continued pride, but because she wasn't yet sure what words would carry the apology without sounding like an excuse. Some things, she had learned from Thomas, were better said with a person standing in front of you than shouted across a dark pasture on a borrowed horse. She banked the fire, locked the shop, and went to bed with the regret still sitting heavy and unresolved in her chest. The first night in weeks she hadn't fallen asleep thinking about wagon specifications. Jesse came back on Wednesday, not because the awkwardness of Monday had resolved itself in either of their minds, but because the wagon order was due and the work didn't care about hurt feelings. Delia had been at the forge since before dawn, trying to make up time she'd lost to worry rather than iron, and by the time Jesse arrived in the late afternoon to check the progress, it was clear to him, the way it would be clear to anyone who understood exhaustion, that she'd been at it far too long without stopping. Neither of them mentioned Monday directly. Instead, Jesse rolled his sleeves without being asked and set to sorting the finished brake rods from the ones still needing work, an unglamorous task that needed doing and that let him stay without either of them having to name why. The shop was quiet, except for the small sounds of the work itself, the scrape of iron against iron, the settling pop of the coals, the wind picking up outside as the September evening cooled toward true autumn. Delia watched him out of the corner of her eye for a while, noting the careful, unhurried way he handled each piece, checking every hitch twice before setting it in its stack, and found herself less annoyed by his presence than she had expected to be after Monday's sharp words. "I'm sorry," Delia said eventually, into the quiet, not looking up from the axle in front of her. "For Monday. You weren't trying to manage me. I know that. I've just had 3 years of men trying to, and I stopped being able to tell the difference for a minute." "I understand it," Jesse said. "Doesn't mean it didn't sting some, but I understand it." She set the hammer down and looked at him properly for the first time since he'd arrived. "Thomas used to say, 'I fought battles that weren't there sometimes,'" she said. "He wasn't wrong. It's just, after he died, everyone who came near this shop wanted something from it. A husband who wanted a business he didn't have to build himself. A bank that wanted its interest. A town that wanted a story about the widow who couldn't manage alone, so they'd have something to talk about at church. I got used to assuming everybody wanted something. "What do you think I want?" Jessie asked, and there was no challenge in it, only genuine curiosity. Delia considered the question longer than a simple one deserved. "I don't know yet," she said, honestly. "That's the strange part. I've been trying to work it out for 3 weeks, and I still don't know. I lost my brother Daniel on a trail drive 6 years ago," Jessie said, after a silence, the words coming slower than his usual plain speech, like something being lifted carefully off a high shelf. "Chain hitch failed on a grade outside Ogallala. Wagon went over, and he went under it. I was 50 yards back and couldn't do a thing but watch." He looked at the brake rod in his hand. "Since then, I check every rig myself, every hitch, every rod. I don't trust another man's word on it. Not because I think people are careless on purpose, but because I watched what happens when nobody checks." Delia set down her own work entirely now, understanding arriving in her chest, with a weight that had nothing to do with iron. "That's why the specifications were so exact," she said. "That first day." "That's why," Jessie said, "and it's part of why I keep coming back here. You check everything the way I do. You don't guess. I haven't met many people who work like that." He reached across for the same brake rod she'd been sorting, their hands arriving at the same piece of iron at the same moment, and neither pulled back immediately. A brief, warm contact, nothing more than the accidental meeting of two people, reaching for the same honest work, and yet it sat between them afterward, like something spoken aloud. "I want you to know," Jessie said, quiet, "that when I offered to talk to Kepler, it wasn't because I doubted you could handle him. It was because I couldn't stand the thought of you carrying it alone, when I was standing right there." Delia looked at him a long moment in the low firelight, the forge banked to embers now, the shop gone dark and close and warm around them. "I'm not used to that," she said. "Somebody standing right there." "I know," Jessie said. "I'd like to change that, if you'll let me try." She didn't answer in words. She only nodded, once, and went back to the work, and the silence that followed was entirely different from the one they'd sat in on Monday. Full, instead of empty, the particular quiet of two people who have found each other's company to be a kind of rest. They worked another hour past the point either of them strictly needed to. The last of the brake rods sorted and set aside for the morning, the forge fire dying down to a low orange glow that painted the shop in a warmth neither wanted to leave. When Jessie finally rose to go, he paused at the door a moment, looking back at her, the way a man looks at something he has only recently understood he does not want to lose. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, and it wasn't really a question about the wagon order at all, and they both knew it. "Same time tomorrow," Delia said, and meant considerably more than the schedule. The last week of September arrived cold and clear, the frost coming earlier than usual, and painting the pasture grass white by morning. And with it came the deadline Delia had been building toward, since the day Jessie Calder first walked through her door. 20 wagons, every chain hitch, every brake rod, every reinforced axle needed to be finished, tested, and delivered to the Diamond K before Walter Kepler's 2-week trial period closed, and before the first cattle train of the season pulled out of Miles City carrying half the county's yearly income on its cars. Delia worked with a focus that left no room for anything but the iron in front of her, and word of the effort spread through town the way word of anything spread, until by Thursday there were people finding reasons to walk past the shop window just to see the finished wagon frames stacking up in neat, impossible rows along the side yard. Ruth Boone brought food she hadn't been asked for, and didn't take payment for, setting plates down on the corner of the workbench with brisk efficiency, and a running commentary on who in town was placing bets on whether the order would finish in time. which Delia found more useful than insulting, since it told her exactly what she was up against. Ezra Coates, too stiff for the close work now, sat by the door and sorted bolts by size, muttering the whole time about how a person could at least let an old man feel useful, though everyone in the shop understood he was there for company as much as labor. And Jesse came every evening after his own long day at the Diamond K, not to take over the work, but to run the finished pieces through the same checks he ran on his own gear. A second set of careful eyes on every hitch, exactly the kind of help that let her keep her name on the work without carrying the whole weight of it alone. He rarely stayed past an hour, mindful of the ranch's early mornings, but the hour was reliable, the same as the sunset, and Delia found she had begun to measure the day's progress, partly by whether he'd arrived yet. By Wednesday, the whole yard smelled of hot iron and frost together, an odd combination that Delia would remember for years afterward as the particular scent of nearly making it. By Friday before dawn, the 20th wagon frame stood finished in the yard, frost silvering the iron in the gray early light, and Delia stood looking at the full row of them, with a kind of tired disbelief that came from having actually done the impossible thing rather than merely hoped to. Walter Kepler arrived at 7, as arranged, to inspect the work before it went out to the ranch, and he walked the row slowly, checking hitches, testing brake rods, running his hand along welds with the particular thoroughness of a man who had a great deal riding on what he found. He straightened up at the last wagon and looked at Delia for a long moment. "This is better work than Pruitt would have given me at any price," he said. "I should have known that from the start. I let a bid on paper talk louder than 3 years of proof, standing right in front of me." "Most people do, at some point," Delia said, without bitterness, because there was no room left in her for bitterness that morning, only the particular clean exhaustion of a job finished well. Jesse stood at the edge of the yard, off to the side, saying nothing, letting the moment belong entirely to Delia and the work she'd built. It was Jesse who began the applause when Kepler extended his hand to shake hers over the contract renewal. Slow, deliberate, a single pair of hands clapping before the small gathered crowd of townspeople caught the sense of the moment and joined in, and Delia felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight for 3 years running. "You didn't have to do that," she said to him quietly, afterward, as the crowd thinned and the wagons began the slow process of loading out to the ranch. "Didn't have to," Jesse agreed. "Wanted to. There's a difference between a man taking credit for a woman's work and a man making sure the room sees it clearly. I know which one I'm interested in being." Delia looked at the row of empty space where 20 wagons had stood an hour before, at the sign overhead that still read Freeman Freight and Forge, at the town that had spent 3 years deciding she was too much for any of them, and found, for the first time since Thomas died, that she believed the verdict might finally be turning. Ezra caught her arm gently as the crowd dispersed, his old eyes bright. "Thomas would have stood right where Kepler stood," he said, "shaking your hand, wondering how he ever doubted you'd manage it." "He never doubted it," Delia said. "I think I was the only one who did, some mornings." "Well," Ezra said, patting her arm once before letting go, "seems there's at least one more person around here who doesn't doubt it either." She did not yet know how much harder the next test would be, or how soon it was coming. The storm came in 2 days early, sweeping down off the mountains on a Sunday night, with a violence the almanac hadn't predicted and the town wasn't ready for, dropping 4 inches of early snow before midnight and showing no sign of slowing. The last shipment, 6 wagons of finishing hardware and replacement gear needed at the rail depot before Monday's cattle train, was still sitting half-loaded in Delia's side yard when the storm broke, and by 11 that night, working alone by lantern light, because she'd sent her one hired hand home hours before the weather turned dangerous. The rear axle of the heaviest wagon gave way under the ice-slicked ground with a crack that carried over the wind. She stood in the snow, looking at the broken axle for a long moment, calculating with a cold, sinking clarity that had nothing to do with the temperature. There was no time to forge a replacement before dawn. There was no other blacksmith in Miles City who could do the work, even if there had been time. If the wagon didn't reach the depot before the 6 o'clock train, the last of the season's contract payment, the payment that would clear her note at the Territorial Trust Bank before the deadline, would not come through, and 3 years of holding on by her fingernails would end in exactly the way the town had always predicted it would. For the first time since Thomas died, Delia Freeman sat down in the snow beside a broken wagon and let herself consider, just for a moment, simply stopping. Not the shop, not the trade, just this one impossible night, this one deadline that had finally, after 3 years of near misses, arrived at the exact moment she had no more strength left to meet it. She thought of the banknote in the locked drawer, of Thomas's order book, of the 20 wagons she'd finished only days before, with her name attached and her pride restored. All of it balanced now, on 6 inches of frozen axle and a clock she could not slow down by wanting to. It was Jesse who found her there. He'd ridden into town against the worst of the storm's advice. Some instinct he didn't examine too closely, pulling him off the Diamond K and toward Freeman Freight and Forge. And when he came around the side yard and saw her sitting in the snow beside the wrecked axle, lantern guttering beside her, something in his chest went cold, in a way the weather alone couldn't explain. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He could see she wasn't, not in the way that mattered most in that moment. "Delia," he said, crouching down in front of her. "Talk to me." "It's over," she said, and her voice, when it came, was steadier than her face. "The axle's gone. There's no time to forge another before the train. I can't make 6 inches of frozen ground move any faster than it wants to, Jesse. I've done everything I know how to do, and it isn't enough this time." "Get up," Jesse said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard from him before. Not command exactly, but a kind of certainty that left no room for argument. He stood and pulled off his coat, tossing it over the broken axle to shield it from the worst of the snow, and reached down to help her to her feet. "You're going to light that forge. I'm going to strip the spare hitch iron off my own saddle rig, and we're going to jury an axle strong enough to hold for one trip to the depot. It won't be pretty. It'll hold." "Jesse, there isn't time." "There's 4 hours till that train," he said. "I've built worse in less, on a trail with nothing but what a saddlebag carried. Get up, Delia. Not anymore. Let me help you." The words landed in her differently than any offer of help ever had. Not a rescue, not a man stepping in front of her to take the work away, but a man standing beside her in the worst hour of 3 hard years, refusing to let her carry the weight alone simply because she had always insisted she could. She got up. They worked through the storm together, the forge fire the only warm thing for a mile in any direction. Jesse holding the iron steady, while Delia's hammer rang out into the snow. Both of them soaked through, and moving faster than either had ever worked before, racing a clock neither could slow. Somewhere in the second hour, past exhaustion, past cold, past every wall she had spent 3 years building, Delia understood with total clarity that she was not doing this alone, and that the not alone part did not diminish a single thing about who she was. The axle held its rough weld by 4 in the morning. They loaded the last of the hardware by lantern light, and Jesse drove the wagon himself through the settling snow, Delia beside him on the seat, both too tired for words, watching the gray edge of dawn come up over the rail depot as the 6 o'clock train sat waiting on the tracks. They made it with 11 minutes to spare. The depot agent, a heavy-set man named Otis, who had seen every kind of freight emergency Miles City had to offer over the years, took one look at the two of them, soaked through, soot-streaked, dead on their feet, and said only that he'd never seen a jury-rigged axle that clean, before he waved the wagon through to the loading dock without further comment. Delia barely heard him. She was watching the cars fill, counting each crate as it disappeared into the freight hold, hardly able to believe the night that had nearly ended in the snow was ending instead in the gray hush of a depot platform at dawn, with the whole of her future rolling away safely on iron wheels. The train pulled out at 6 o'clock precisely, the last of the season's freight secured in its cars, and Delia stood on the depot platform in the thin gray light, watching it go, with a kind of exhausted disbelief that took a full minute to soften into something like joy. The contract was fulfilled. Every wagon, every hitch, every brake rod had reached the Diamond K and the rail depot exactly as promised, and within the week, the final payment would clear, enough to settle the note at the Territorial Trust Bank before the spring deadline, with room to spare for the first time in 3 years. She turned to find Jessie still beside her, snow-dusted, red-eyed with exhaustion, watching her, rather than the departing train. "We did that," she said, half a question, as though she needed to hear it confirmed to fully believe it. "You did that," Jessie said. "I just held the iron." "You held the iron at midnight in a blizzard, because you rode 3 miles through weather no sensible man rides through," Delia said. "Don't stand there and make yourself small about it," Jessie called her. "I've spent 3 years being told what I'm not allowed to need. I'm not going to let you tell me what you didn't do." That drew a tired, genuine laugh out of him, and for a moment, they simply stood together on the platform, the exhaustion, and the cold, and the relief, all tangled up into something neither wanted to end. News of the storm and the midnight repair had already begun to travel by the time they walked back into town, delivered by the depot agent to anyone who'd listen, and by noon, half of Miles City seemed to know that Jessie Calder had ridden through a blizzard to keep the Freeman contract alive. Delia found she didn't mind the talk this time, the way she once would have. It wasn't a story about a woman who couldn't manage. It was a story about 2 people who had managed together, and there was a difference, and for the first time she found the town's gossip landing somewhere close to the truth. 3 days later, once the shop had caught up on sleep and the smaller work that had piled up during the crisis, Jessie came by in the early evening with something wrapped in a scrap of canvas, the particular careful way a man carries something he made himself, rather than bought. "I want to give you something," he said, setting it on the counter. "Made it myself, evenings, back at the bunkhouse. Wasn't sure I'd ever have the nerve to bring it over." Delia unwrapped the canvas and found a hammer inside, a proper forging hammer, but smaller than the standard, the head balanced differently, the wooden handle shaped and sanded to a grip that would fit a smaller hand than most smiths carried. Carved into the base of the handle, small and careful, were the letters D.F. She stood holding it for a long moment, testing the weight the way she tested everything, and found that it settled into her palm as though it had been made for exactly the shape and strength of her hand, because it had. "I noticed your hand cramps by the end of a long day," Jessie said, watching her test it. "The standard handles are all cut for a man's grip. Didn't seem right that you should have to fight your own tools on top of everything else." Delia's throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the cold outside, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with something she hadn't let show in front of another person since the week Thomas died. "Nobody's built me anything since he passed," she said, quiet. Everyone offers to build things for themselves, using me as the reason. You built this to fit my hand and nothing else." She turned the hammer over once more, running her thumb across the carved initials, and thought of the store-bought gloves that had fit her so precisely weeks before, and understood now that it had never really been about gloves or hammers at all. It had been about a man who paid attention to the actual shape of her, rather than the shape the town had decided she ought to be. "That's the only kind of building worth doing," Jessie said, and reached out, slow enough that she could have stopped him, to brush a single tear from her cheek with a gentleness that felt like the whole of the last 5 weeks arriving at once. "I'm not trying to be the reason you don't have to work hard anymore, Delia. I'm trying to be the reason you don't have to work hard alone." She set the hammer down carefully on the counter and closed the small distance between them herself, resting her forehead against his shoulder for just a moment. Not a kiss, not yet, only the simple, enormous relief of a woman who had finally found someone worth leaning on. Jessie's arms came around her carefully, as though she were something he still could not quite believe he was allowed to hold, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, the forge fire ticking softly as it cooled, the whole shop settling into the particular stillness of two people who have stopped waiting for something and simply arrived at it instead. "Ask me something, Jessie," she said, into the quiet of the shop. "I think you've been meaning to for a while." He asked her in December, in front of the forge where they'd first properly known each other, with Ezra Coates sitting nearby, pretending not to watch and failing entirely, and Delia said yes before he'd finished the whole of the question, which made them both laugh in a way that felt like the truest answer either of them could have given. He had planned the words for days, he admitted afterward, something careful and complete about partnership, and standing beside her rather than in front of her. He got as far as Delia Freeman. "I'd like to spend the rest of my life," before she'd already answered him, and he'd had to finish the sentence anyway, for the record, with Ezra loudly insisting from his chair by the door that a proposal ought to be finished properly, even if the answer had already arrived. 2 weeks earlier, on a cold, bright Tuesday, Delia had walked into the Territorial Trust Bank with the full sum of her note in hand, watched the clerk stamp "paid in full" across the paper she had carried, folded in a locked drawer for 3 years, and set the receipt down beside Thomas's old order book that evening, with a quiet the whole shop seemed to share in. She did not cry over it. She had done all her crying over that particular fear the night of the storm, and what was left now was simply a clean, settled kind of peace. They married in February, at the Yellowstone Valley Chapel, on the north end of town, a simple ceremony, because Delia had no patience for elaborate, and Jessie had none for waiting. Ruth Boone made the cake and cried through the whole service, insisting afterward she'd known since the second week of September, which was, by her own account, true. Ezra Coates sat in the front row in his good coat and did not try particularly hard to hide how he felt about watching Thomas's forge and Thomas's widow arrive at exactly this kind of happiness. Even Walter Kepler attended, standing near the back with his hat in his hand, and told anyone who asked that he considered it good business sense to keep his best contractor's household in good spirits. Amos Pruitt did not attend, having quietly lowered his rates to something closer to fair, once word got around Miles City about the quality of Freeman iron, and no one in town thought it worth mentioning his absence twice. The town's opinion of Delia Freeman revised itself the way small-town opinions generally do, not with any announcement, not with anyone admitting they'd been wrong, but through the slow replacement of one set of comments with another, until too much for any man simply stopped being said, and something closer to the truth took its place instead. Jessie moved into the rooms above the shop that spring, and continued at the Diamond K through the season, and in the evenings he was as likely to be found checking hitches at Freeman Freight and Forge as at the ranch, the two of them working the same unhurried rhythm they'd found that first September. Careful, exact, each trusting the other's hands completely. Delia kept the small hammer he'd made her on its own hook beside the anvil, separate from the rest of her tools, and reached for it first on every job small enough to allow the choice. It was not, by any practical measure, her best hammer. It was simply the one that reminded her, every time her palm closed around the handle, that somebody had once sat up late, thinking of nothing but the exact shape of her hand. The sign over the door never changed. Freeman Freight and Forge, the letters repainted every spring, same as always. Delia added only a single small line beneath it that summer, in her own careful hand. Est, by Thomas and Delia Freeman. It was Jesse who suggested she needn't change the name at all for his sake, and Delia, who told him, gently, that she'd never once considered it. The Forge had never needed a different name. It had only ever needed someone willing to stand beside her while she kept it running, rather than someone who wanted credit for saving it. That, in the end, was the thing Miles City had never understood, and the thing Delia had needed 5 weeks and one terrible storm to fully believe herself, that the strength people had spent years calling too much had never been the problem at all. She had simply been waiting, without knowing it, for a man who understood that helping someone carry a weight is not the same as telling them they were wrong to carry it alone, for as long as they had to. Jesse Calder had understood that, from the very first afternoon, holding a wagon axle steady, without being asked, saying nothing about it afterward. He understood it still, years later. On every ordinary evening he walked into the warm light of her forge, and simply picked up the nearest tool that needed a second pair of hands. It had simply taken the right man to say it plainly, once, in the middle of the worst night either of them had faced. Not anymore. Let me help you,